Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We're going to give a little bit of time for attendees to come into the Zoom room, and then we will start sharply at noon p.m. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jen Kavexis. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Salazar Center. As we begin today's webinar, I would like to acknowledge that the land I am on is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. Before I introduce today's theme and speakers, I have just a few housekeeping items to share with you. We absolutely encourage and love when our attendees share comments, questions, and thoughts. We just ask that you drop those into the chat. We'll probably have more questions than we can get to during the time of our webinar together today, but we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. This session is being recorded, and we will share that recording with all of the registrants afterwards. This is a series, so there is another webinar coming up, and we encourage you to check out, keep your eyes open for registration for that event, which will be in early September, where we'll focus on the importance of connectivity in this conversation of climate resilience and conservation. Today's webinar is the second in our series. This series was inspired by a recent research effort done by the Network for Landscape Conservation and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy that is focused on how landscape conservation partnerships are incorporating climate change into their work. The research team surveyed and interviewed hundreds of representatives from the landscape conservation field across the US. And among the many themes and recommendations that emerged from this research, the critical role of strong communication and data tools was a consistent theme that came across the conversations with the participants. And that's why that is our focus for our conversation today. Future webinars will pick up different key themes from the report, so stay tuned for those webinars. These webinars are also helping to create a foundation of conversation prior to the Salazar Center's 5th Annual Symposium on Conservation Impact, to be held in October. And this year, we're going to be looking at how nature-based solutions can help address both climate and biodiversity challenges across North America. The registration is now open for that. We're super excited. Please check out the registration site. We'd love to see as many of you there as possible. Early bird registration ends on July 28th. So please check out the registration site. So now I'm going to shift to our fabulous speakers for the day. I'm super excited about our lineup. We have some great speakers who've done some really interesting work across the US. Our moderator for today will be Elizabeth Tully, who is Associate Director for the Climate Adaptation Fund with the Wildlife Conservation Society. She'll be followed by Hannah Marie Garcia, who is with the Indigenous Sentinels Network and coordinator at the Aleut community of St. Paul Island. She'll be joined by her colleague, Emily DeGroot, who is the founder, chief operating officer at the Open Landscape Network. And finally, we'll hear from Simon Rucker, who is executive director at the Maine Appalachian Land Trust. Over to you, Liz.
Okay, hi. I don't see my own video. Just make sure. Jen, can you see? Oh, I see me.
We can see you.
Great, I see me now too. Okay, so welcome. My name is Liz Tully. As Jen said, I manage the Climate Adaptation Fund, and I'll be moderating the session. So this series divides into various aspects of the new report that Jen described. The Climate Adaptation Fund actually has supported many of the projects that are in the report. That's one reason why I'm very excited to have been invited to moderate. Another is that something that's a little atypical for a fund like ours, which focuses on implementation of adaptation actions on the ground in the landscape, is that we put a heavy focus on strategic communications that I'll talk to you about in a minute. But I'll just mention that the Climate Adaptation Fund is managed through the Wildlife Conservation Society, where I work, and it's made possible by the generous support of the Doris Duke Foundation. And through this partnership, the Climate Adaptation Fund has awarded over $26 million across the past 12 years to 140 adaptation projects throughout the United States. We're up to about 48 states, Commonwealth, US territories, and tribal nations. So it's very exciting that we saw some of the projects in the report that was just released by the Lincoln Institute and the Network for Landscape Conservation. Land conservation organizations play a really vital role in planning and implementing solutions that are needed to address both the biodiversity and climate change crisis. And one of the findings from the report is that the number of organizations that include climate change as a priority is increasing. It's definitely on our radar. It's not a new issue to people. However, the number of organizations that are taking strategic action and making intentional shifts to address climate change is much lower. And our panelists today will share examples from their work about how data and communication tools can actually help increase that number. We'll make that leap. From their examples, we'll understand how we can increase the number of organizations that are making those intentional shifts. And then especially also to help articulate and amplify the critical role of conservation in addressing climate change. So, using innovative tools and strategic communications tactics is actually a very critical component of the Climate Adaptation Fund strategy and our theory of change. Our fund, like I said, it focuses on implementing climate-informed conservation actions that yield adaptation benefits for wildlife, ecosystems, and people. But we actually require our applicants to submit a strategic communications plan in their proposal. And we actually set aside $25,000 of the grant award to execute that plan. And then we include strategic communications deliverables in the contract. And I'm insisting on using that word strategic in front of communications when I talk about this, because we need our communication approaches to be strategic and thoughtful in a field that is growing like this and so nuanced and so reliant on local conditions and contexts and partnerships. We need that to leverage the work that's being done. So we promote, by strategic, I mean we promote a target audience specific communications and outreach approach. So the messages, the venues through which you'll get your messages out, the products they'll be in, need to be responsive and tailored to each target audience's function or source of power, like how they will actually act to help you meet the goals you're trying to reach, their knowledge level, their attitude, where they get their information from. And we put a focus on this and I prioritize it because we do this so that the impacts of a carefully designed climate adapted conservation project don't remain confined to the boundaries of the work site. This work is innovative, it's collaborative and cross-sectoral. It's conservation thinking outside of the box. It's difficult and new solutions are being proposed or have been selected to address a range of future scenarios. It takes a lot of work. And in this particular growth stage in this field of practice, we need to get as much out of that work as we can and actually lay the groundwork for increased learning, scaling, and replication. So amplifying what was done, why, how it went is more critical than ever to growing this field of practice for adaptation and for articulating what's happening with landscape conservation organizations and collaboratives and what they did to and how they can address the climate challenge. The issue isn't new anymore, but this report featured in this webinar series, has found that it's really just not growing fast enough. So I'm excited to pass it on to our panelists who can share some of their work and how they incorporated different data tools and communication tools and the implication of that for their longer term impact. Over to you, Hannah.
Awesome, thank you, Liz. And I'm going to quickly share screen. All of us are accustomed to Zoom sharing at this point, but again, my name is Hannah Marie Garcia. I work for the Aleut community of St. Paul Islands tribal government, where I'm our Indigenous Sentinels Network coordinator. I am very fortunate to live and work on the Dena'ina lands here in Anchorage, Alaska. And so I'm really grateful to join this webinar series and be a part of this dialogue today with all of our attendees to really discuss how our programs and tools have helped landscape conservation partnerships in our region plan and continue to support existing capacity, not just build capacity, but support the existing capacity in our communities in implementing the on-the-ground strategies that address the challenges that they're facing on their local scale, while, as Liz mentioned, still finding a way to amplify that and communicate that out to a broader network. And so we're really excited. I say we, Emily will join me after I finish my overview to talk about the tools that we're developing with Open Landscape Network and continuing to expand with our ISN network and what we're doing to really help practice active stewardship, including communities in the narrative and telling the story of the landscape and the work that we're doing in our region. And so when I think of landscape scale conservation, I also like to show this map that grounds me in the work that we do here in Alaska. And I think that is important to remember for those who might not be from our region. In some ways, I think this map emphasizes a lot of that the organizations, communities that I work with in ISN are already doing this work at the scale that we're talking about today. Are actively working on finding ways to have better data integration and tools to address local needs and priorities as communities grapple with food security, resource management, and more. And these activities are taking place across our regions where they're having to figure out how to communicate what's happening on Attu Island to folks in Anchorage and this massive landscape that we are already operating in. And so I also like to say that here in Alaska, when we think about conservation and the activities that we do to address climate change or resource management, it's not necessarily focused on our most limited resource. How do we conserve our most limited resource? Because it's not timber, it's not fisheries. Our most limited resource here in Alaska is often people. It's people doing this work and having enough capacity to do this scale of work that is required. And so we often are trying to find ways in order to better support our limited resource of people to do the work at the scale that we are operating in. And so I just took you on kind of the statewide landscape of where we're working, but the origin of the program that I am fortunate enough to be a part of, the Indigenous Sentinels Network, started in the middle of the Bering Sea on an island called St. Paul Island. It's a 40 square mile island and one of the Pribilof Islands. There's both St. Paul and St. George are the Pribilof Islands. And it's considered one of the most important seabird nesting sites in the Bering Sea, important habitat for marine mammals, often described as kind of the Galapagos of the North, just the way that the environment and the shelf and ocean ecosystems and currents exist around this island really help provide such a breadth of ecosystem diversity. And so there's a lot of vital cultural species that support our community's lifestyle. We live a very subsistence lifestyle on the island, hunting, fishing, harvesting berries and eggs. We also have a commercial fishing economy on the island. So needless to say, the community has deep ties to their environment and being stewards and resources of which they depend on. So they have been using ISN on island for over 20 years now to do co-management work with their marine mammals. And so as ISN began to grow off island, communities in our surrounding areas recognized, well, oh, the technology and tools in which you were using to collect data and communicate that data to federal agencies, can it also work for migratory birds? Can it also work for coastal erosion? And so we've expanded from our island on St. Paul to operating in spaces across the state, addressing conservation and monitoring issues beyond the marine mammals. And now we're looking at monitoring migratory birds, or monitoring harvest of resources, or working in commercial fisheries. So the technology itself has allowed it to be flexible and adaptable to meet those needs, but the mission and heart of the work that we're doing is still rooted in communities and local issues. And so our mission is to collect Indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge and scientific information to empower holistic ecosystem and community-centered natural resource management. So data collection in ISN is rooted in local and traditional knowledge and Western science methods, recognizing the diversity of qualitative and quantitative data that are so valuable in decision-making processes, whether we're talking about policy, management, conservation, and ensuring that all sources of knowledge are both communicated and protected in that communication and how we are doing resource management decisions and conservation work in our regions. And so while the network is broad and the communities involved are diverse, the ISN components are essentially a series of online databases that are community owned. We have a set of data collection tools that we have developed that rural communities or communities across our state can collect information, kind of akin to an electronic environmental survey form, just from their smartphones. We don't require Wi-Fi or cell signal to collect data, which is a huge challenge here in Alaska. And so doing this work in remote and kind of far off landscapes is very possible with the tools that we have. And then of course we have this partnership development and support and networking and communication built in through the thread of all of this data collection. And so as you know, Indigenous organizations seek to become more active partners or lead their own community monitoring efforts at the local level, demand for systems to expand out of the Bering Sea have helped us to scale our communication, to evolve with the technology. And now ISN is filling a very distinct niche for communities seeking to implement a monitoring program without having to start from scratch or making significant monetary investments in software infrastructure of their own, but also still taking ownership of the technology in which they are creating their own community-driven environmental monitoring programs that meet their needs first. And really another challenge that we're helping to address with our software is just recognizing that there's an urgent need to not only collect data, but also increase the seasonal breadth and spatial resolution. Communities are experts in their own right in their environment. They are living there day in and day out. And so I think including and empowering communities to take part as active researchers alongside climate change research that's happening just in a season is so important. And one of the strengths of ISN is its ability to scale from individual to landscape scale observations and provide an existing framework to build custom community-driven monitoring programs that again meet the community's needs first, and then help scale up communication to help address broader regional climate change and conservation challenges. And so with ISN, we have a number of active monitoring programs, as I mentioned, coastal erosion, migratory bird. We also work a lot with oceans and fisheries research. And so one of our programs, the Skipper Science Partnership, is working to help build pipelines. This is the example of how we're communicating information out. We have active fleets, over 300 fishermen actively logging observations from the ocean, and part of the network and the goal of that program is to then be a bridge to center community voices in fisheries management and resources. And so we are working to co-develop studies where fisheries can communicate directly with researchers that provide the reports to Fisheries Management Council. So there's another pipeline for communities to communicate their data through this partnership of network. There's co-developed studies that are happening as well with our fisheries researchers, where scientists are working directly with fleets to mobilize them to collect data that can supplement surveys that the fisheries science centers already do. We're working alongside federal and state agencies where our community members are actively helping them address their goals of identifying and analyzing waters, catalogs, and streams across the state, where community members can be also the field and tech hands collecting that information. So we have a lot of processes, and so really where we're going and scaling and working with ISN is that we recognize that as much as technology is helpful for the efficiency process, it's also a human process. And communities need to be reflected in the tools and solutions that we're providing them with, and they need to be part of that designing process. And so as ISN partnerships have continued to grow, we're really excited to be working with ON to help with that scaling. And so with that, I'll pass it to Emily to kind of talk about a little bit more about what that scaling looks like.
Sure. Hi, my name is Emily DeGroot, and I'm the core member of the Open Landscape Network, and be very privileged to be speaking here with you and also working alongside ISN. And everything that Hannah Marie described it's a very big technical challenge to make sure that we're building something that scales. It's so often that communities are working, gaining momentum, gaining local attention, support, and then just at that critical moment struggle to scale because the tools they have are not equipped to enable them to do so. So at the Open Landscape Network, we've done a lot of intensive research to make sure that the full stack approach to building these systems doesn't cause any limit to the initiatives that are already in place in the communities that already have a vision on how to improve the health of their landscapes. I think that's our time, but I'm happy to go into more detail no problem, into more detail into the question and answer period. So thank you so much.
It's my turn. Thanks, guys. I'm Simon Rucker. I work for the Maine Appalachian Trail Land Trust. Hold on, I'm about to share my screen. And we do land conservation all along the Appalachian Trail in Maine, which you can see on here. And like many of you, we wanted strategic conservation priorities, and we do a lot of GIS mapping and have internal data and things like that. And this screenshot is kind of like what that is. And I'm sure a lot of you have this within your organization. I've seen very similar ones from many others. And what we did was in 2020, we put together a bunch of GIS data, and this is based a lot on climate change data, like TNC's Resilient Connected Landscapes data. And we scaled it to the parcel, which you can see here. There's 6,128 parcels that we sort of work with within 2 miles of the AT here in Maine. And that was like really innovative, and we spent a lot of time kind of describing that and communicating to partners and using the, talking about which data should we use and where should we be focusing and what's our boundary area, and all those questions that you deal with a lot in land conservation, right, within a land trust. And that was sort of our version 1. And we put together a nice report that we published. And it was very glossy and nice because we wanted people to read it and understand our methodology behind data. But I think a lot now in talking about climate change and how to convey urgency and how to use data is about communications tools. And it's not about what the data is, it's about how you're talking about the data and who your specific audience is. Because you look at this slide here, which I'm sure you're all finding very boring, it's like a back shop thing, right? This is the engine. You don't go and communicate with a landowner or a foundation or donors or state government or whatever using this tool, right? Because they're going to sort of say, I don't know what this means. This is overwhelming. You don't let them use it on its own. So we shifted from talking about data to talking about what are our tools to convey messaging to people. And so we went from this to doing things like this, which was sort of our next stage where we did assessments of individual parcels, right? It's hard to see, but there's a little blue parcel here. And this has data per parcel, right? So this parcel has this many acres of TNC data, right? That's very, sorry, car driving by. That's very, specific for a specific audience, right? If you're talking about trying to get funding for a conservation project, you sort of use this kind of information here. So, but this is not something you would communicate to the public with. So we're continuing to kind of evolve how we talk about the data. What are some different tools we can use? So we went from this sort of like report format, which is still a little bit dry, to moving to things like this, like ArcGIS online tools. So this is one of the ArcGIS online tools called Scene Viewer. In Scene Viewer, you can make these kind of quick apps like this. And, you can sort of almost have like a storyboard, like if you're writing a film. So this is a storyboard that shows you how many viewpoints each of these parcels is viewed from and kind of the level of climate resilience on each of these parcels. And then you can kind of see the viewpoints, the little camera kind of up here. So it conveys something else about how climate change sort of fits into the narrative of conservation of the Maine AT landscape here. Like, what are you trying to do? Why is this important? And reaching more people about that sort of importance. And this is pretty good, but we're continuing to kind of evolve tools too. So you can also do 3D mapping that's sort of place-based, right? So this is an actual view on the approach to Barren Mountain. So this is the mountain back here that you were looking at before. This is the actual road when you're going in, and you can put different features in these tools to sort of help people sort of interact with the landscape. Because, the best thing about land conservation is sort of getting out on the land. And we're trying to do that as much as possible with these kind of tools that you can deploy. And the sort of entry barrier to using these tools is getting lower and lower every day. So if you have data, there's tons of like cool things you can do with it. And now we're actually working on things like taking actual views. So this is a view from the Appalachian Trail in Maine, over from that mountain, Barren Mountain. And you can incorporate, using graphic design and other tools, you can sort of like reverse engineer and put the GIS data on the landscape. So you can say to people, this is what it's like when you're standing there. Like, this is the view and sort of like what goes into it. And climate resilient land is a critical component of that. Like, what does a climate resilient landscape look like? And we're trying to sort of put those pieces together for different people to convey as much of that as we can. And I think there are a lot of tools for that now, and we have the data, and it's just about getting creative and sort of focusing on your audience. So I'll stop for now. And then I think we'll open up.
Yep. All right, I think that we're going to start with opening up our Q&A session. Jenny can tell me I'm totally wrong if I am, but I think that's what we're doing. Those were great presentations. I mean, Emily, like what you said at the end really resonated with me about how communities are sometimes just gaining all the right momentum, like right at a point when they need the right tools to launch that momentum and go somewhere with it, and they don't have it, or resources pulled back. I totally understand and see that happen to some of our projects. There's an amazing mix of ingredients that come together to create momentum, and we really need to make sure we have like that runway built. And yeah, I love to what you said, Simon, the visualization of that climate resilient landscape. Any way to get people to have a more tangible sense of what climate resilience is and what the land looks like, what a project looks like, helps. Like, a lot of times it just looks like a regular conservation project, or a regular landscape is just designed with really deep intentionality to respond to new climate scenarios. So you might be deploying very similar conservation actions on the ground, just higher up in the watershed. Sometimes it can look wildly different, but it's nice to get that sense to people like, this is actually accessible and will look very familiar to you once you dive into this way of thinking and this way of managing your land. So I really would like to invite any attendees to add questions into the chat, and I'll read some off to our panelists. And while you're doing that, I do have a question that's open. Well, there's one here in the chat that came pretty quick that's pretty nice and specific. So it says, Simon spoke to these tools being more and more accessible. It sounds like your team has found some Esri tools to be usable without specific expertise and affordable. Is that correct, Simon? Do you feel that there are some Esri tools out there that those without formal training can use?
So I will say, so Owen wrote before and said, was your last image actually generated by GIS? I will say it was not. But what we are doing was we're trying to, as much as possible, base the data views on actual views from the Appalachian Trail. So we have, thousands of photos from the Appalachian Trail of these different views. And we've actually plotted them out with view cones. So you'll have, your right bearing, your left bearing, and, the distance in the landscape. But the 3D tools from Esri are really good, but you need really powerful computing ability to have them and present with them. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've done presentations with like ArcGIS, like some of those online tools, and they like crash my computer, and you're like, oh, and so what we've actually done is we're going back to taking those 3D generated images and having a graphic designer like basically take the blobs of GIS data and put it on real photographs that we've taken. And we're going to have another publication. Actually, it's like a 11 by 17 kind of guide, that we're paying to print. Because again, sometimes going back to these more simple tools like a printed thing can get people, it can get a hold of people more than like, oh, here's another story map. Like, I love story maps too, but there's a time and place for everything. Steve's question about the Esri tools. Yes, if you're a nonprofit, you can get ArcGIS software and accounts for like a couple $100 a year. It's relatively inexpensive for a particular user. And they have so many tools that they're pushing through ArcGIS Online. And the big cost is like getting the data housed, you know, because there's credit costs on Esri for doing that. But you know, you can make. We also have in the works a dashboard. I don't know. You might have seen during COVID, like COVID dashboards, right, where you could zoom into a state and it would change the data, and you'd see like different cool things coming up. We've experimented with that too, and the learning curve is really just doing it. You don't need a lot of technical background. I'm not. I never. You know, I've taken a few GIS courses, but that's it. And you know, a lot of the heavy database work is work that you need. Like a GIS specialist to do. But our GIS contractor, she always says to me, she's like, you're really lucky. You guys get to like experiment with these cool tools. Meanwhile, she's doing all the back shop, you know, database, boring stuff, coding that she's done, you know, for like years in the same way. So I do think I would encourage people, look at ArcGIS Online for some of these different tools and how to use them, because they're making them very user-friendly too.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to take a question from the chat and ask Hannah and Emily, and then Simon, definitely add on if you want to after. So what tips and lessons do you have, if you have any you want to share, about making what language and words you use to make climate communications more accessible and understandable? Both of you work with a range of audiences. So for example, this so Sophie has said, I always struggle with explaining climate resilience in a way that is both accurate, but also enjoyable to read. I think in the science world, we all struggle with these two opposing things: exciting, accessible, but also succinct and accurate. But what does that look like for you, Hannah and Emily, in your work with climate resilience in particular, and your audiences?
I'll dive in first. Okay, and then Emily can join in. Thank you, Sophie, for that question too, and Liz for helping to explain it. I think a lot of the tips and lessons that I have learned is the co-development of the story. I think that's so important. I mean, if you have questions about how an audience or community is going to understand, start with that dialogue and develop the way of how best it would be communicated to their audience and their community. A lot of the communities that we work with also like to see, where I've been humbled too, is their representation of their local names, their language, the importance of art in so many of that communication style. And I love, to Simon's point too, about having simple tools. I know we can talk about these technology tools, but a lot of the communication of climate resilience in some of these areas can't even really be done without paper and models. Some of the villages that I work with only have one computer or bandwidth. So thinking about flash drives or paper, something very visually appealing, as well as in their language, and something that Emily and I have talked about immensely is that it needs to be communities need to be reflected in both the technology and in the story that's being told about climate resilience. And so, you know, climate resilience is kind of a complex word, but it is also something that is very human. I mean, it's talking about their access to their food sources, traditional food sources, or the protection of a stream that they've used since childhood, and weaving in that kind of local and grounding context in these stories and co-developing it with communities, I think is something that is so important in this work.
Yes, I agree with everything you said, of course. And that's been a huge priority in our systems, is making sure that the languages of the communities is being reflected in the systems, and the images that reflect how they think about their communities and landscapes is there as well. And to such a degree that sometimes, you use such a diversity of words for one thing, and making sure that all of those words can be included for the individuals that are using the systems. Another thing that we find really important is that there should be just the data that you need to see to make the decision. So when there's decision makers that have to make a critical decision, that they're not overwhelmed with all of the data, that they're given the correct data that they need to make the right decision at the right time, but then still have that drill down access to find the information that went into it. And that's been something that's been really exciting that we've seen from decision makers in the landscapes, that suddenly they're like, okay, great, I have now just that information I need to give transparency to the community, to do the reporting I need without being overwhelmed, or having to crawl through all of the data that is there. Yes.
Great tips from both of you. I mean, starting with co-development down to that, focus on just the data that decision maker needs to understand. Thank you both. I have one more for Hannah Marie and for Emily, and then Simon, I have a couple others for you coming after that. So there's one quick, I'm going to put two together for Hannah Marie and for Emily. I had it. We've got quite a few questions bumping my chat up here a little bit. Okay, so Hannah Marie used the term ILTK. I know a lot of us are familiar with TEK. Can you tell us the difference? And then the next bigger question for both of you is, actually this could be for Simon as well. So do any of your organizations have data governance strategies or agreements that incorporate or consider Indigenous knowledge and protecting and culturally important sites, or transparency in the procedures for data collection and dissemination? It's new territory for a lot of us. How do you manage those topics to inform policy change? For example, in like federal and state management processes. So the first, give us a sense of what ILTK is as it relates to TEK, if it does. And then what kinds of data governance strategies or inclusions do you put in your agreements to cover data sovereignty, protecting Indigenous knowledge, and protecting culturally important sites? Has that come up?
Yeah, all very big questions.
Yeah.
So I will do my best to summarize them in the time that we have left. But I think, yes, there is a difference between traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and in the sense that you do need to be sensitive, and also I think as Western scientists or policymakers, sometimes I think we are frustrated with the fact that change, or that communities may prefer one over the other. And so that's the first point I like to bring up, is that sometimes talking with the region that you're working with and what they prefer is the perfect place to start, and how they perceive that, and decide that. But of course, as we're talking in this webinar, scaling up and communicating that out to broader audiences, I think just being unafraid to say that the definition can also be holistic, but that there are variations in that definition is really important to get your head around. So local knowledge, I particularly use that term, especially when I'm working with commercial fisheries entities or communities that both include Indigenous and non-Indigenous. There's a lot of resources out there, and I'll try to find it and drop it into the chat, or Steve, or connect offline about an excellent paper in summary that kind of go off of that. And so to wrap it up, you should be sensitive and careful to use, but obviously too, it's rooted in how the communities want to express their knowledge and what they are operating in. And then our organization, to Carly's point, do have data government strategies. So we in the Indigenous Central Network have approached and are grappling with building in data sovereignty into these tools. We have stood up an Indigenous Sentinels Advisory Assembly, so a collection of organizations and community leaders to help us work through this discussion. So in talking about how communities collect data, a lot of what we've also seen with our audiences and who we're working with is the importance of data rematriation and ownership of data. So ensuring that research isn't just coming in to collect data through a community-based monitoring program and then taking that information out, that it's actually owned solely by the community members collecting it. And so the way that data is structured in the database is that it's St. Paul data, or it's our Skipper Science Communities data. And so it's separated out in that ownership structure. And then there's applications and processes in place in terms of what type of information is shared. So we work through with each community Do you want the names hidden? Do you want your fisheries vessels hidden? Do you want your hunting specific area not to be the GPS point that you're going to use internally to understand your local needs and resource management? But when you extrapolate and communicate that outward, do you want that to be a polygon? So with a region, no one wants to give away their favorite berry picking patch. Like, and so it's addressing those needs and building in that trust from the beginning, that it's asking them, what do you want to share? Because at the end of the day, the hope is that this is providing the scale and the opportunities to communicate out, but it is also important and vital to ensure that we're protecting sensitive knowledge, cultural knowledge. And we've had discussions too about, I'm looking at a question or topics that came up about important sites, and discussing with, current researchers that might be doing migratory bird research on islands along the evolution chain. And there's unawareness of specific sacred sites on those islands. And so working through mapping too with communities, at least understanding the history of the land that you're about to go on, so that you can have that sense before you go in and do a migratory bird survey. And so when these topics across, I'm reading the question again. Yeah. Yeah. I think those are some main points.
Yeah. Did you say you want me to read the question again?
Sure. I'm trying to find it. If I touched everything.
So yeah, it's do your organizations have any data governance strategies or agreements that speak to Indigenous knowledge, protection of culturally important sites? I think you've hit quite a few of these, or transparency in the procedures that you use for data collection, or should be used. Maybe not, your organization in particular, but should be used for data collection, analyzing the data, disseminating that data. And how you manage those topics across like different scales to inform policy change, or for example, like federal and state natural resource management processes.
I think one last thing I'd add, and we might even have Emily chime in too, is that we take the ownership, community-owned data very seriously. And I think in Western science and management and communication, citing communities particularly. So we've been working with Emily on the tech and involving some things about tracking too, when data is downloaded, when it's shared, and discussing that in some of the flexibility that we're doing. But I'll leave it there. Jen.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the most important thing about these systems is they have to be trusted by the communities that are using them. If they are not trusted, then they won't be used and they won't be of use. So that being the biggest priority is making sure that the data is protected and stored, easy to access, but also enables communities to use the data in the ways that they want to and share it with who they want to. And that was quite a technical feat to be able to, even down to each property, each small piece of data, who can have access to it for how long, when, how can we make sure we have transparency into that, so that the stakeholders that are trying to engage with these communities, they already have systems in place. They're from the financial sector, oil, like they're in all these sectors that have these systems. And by providing a system that enables these communities to be empowered and know that their data is protected and secured, it enables them to be at the same level, or even hopefully even in a bigger, stronger position to negotiate and figure out how they do want to work with these other stakeholders in ways that reflect the respect that they deserve. And yeah, they have incredible knowledge that needs to be respected and protected. And from our perspective, that was one of the biggest priorities, is first make sure it's a system that the data is in, stored, and protected, and then provide tools that can be layered on top of that you can use the data in different ways. So certainly from our perspective, we don't own the data, it is the community's data.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That makes me think about some of the contract negotiation that we have at the Climate Adaptation Fund with projects that have either fully led, designed, implemented by a tribal organization, or have a tribal agency as a partner. And it does those like very specific like products and timelines during which can be accessed by whom seems to be very important. And I think on a bigger scale, it's also with like the historical power dynamic, so that these communities, tribes or not, but local communities, can't just be kind of consumed and used and moved on from, and you empowering them to be the anchor and the source of the original source for that data, I think is pretty important in some of these, the way contracts are structured. and the Western world also just kind of adjusting to new ways of viewing ownership and access.
And it's so critical that you think about these things at the beginning of the system when you're developing it, because if you don't think about it at the early stages, it can't be something you think about 5 years later when the data is all there. You have to be thinking about it at the beginning and making those right technology decisions at the start.
And
Yeah.
last point too is that the technology decisions is which tool. I think a lot of our community members are switching actually from as we 1, 2, 3 survey work to seeking out tools such as ISN to use instead, because of the fact that the data is on a platform housed in a software or cloud area that's not protected or could be potentially, owned by another entity. And so there's those kind of questions to engage with communities too about how secure do you want the software that you're using to address your data sovereignty needs.
Yeah, thank you. And Simon, this might come up in your work. Some of your stakeholders are local communities, tribes. Do you have anything you want to add to this? It's okay if not, just wanted to check.
Oh, no, yeah, I mean, I would just say, here in Maine, all of Maine is unceded territory of the Wabanaki tribes. It's a confederacy of 4 tribes. They each have natural resource departments, and so they have their own data systems and tools that they use to look at, what are their lands that they are interested in for access or for conservation or things like that. I think access is a particular issue for, things like gathering sweetgrass for making baskets, or harvesting black ash, which is a species for also making baskets, but is culturally significant for the Wabanaki tribes. And so we don't use any of our data to make decisions on behalf of any tribes or individuals. Even if we do have lines of communication, so if there's specific requests, we can sort of help with those. But mostly it's about, we do things like, if we're working on a new conservation project, like Emily said, the beginning is crucial, right? You don't start working on a conservation project without first interfacing with the appropriate body for the Wabanaki people, and then they can decide. And then, sometimes it might be like, okay, we're not interested in this. Okay, you move on. But it's also, there's sort of the notion of the data thing. Like, we also have data that shows potential sites that might be of importance to the tribes, and we don't do anything with that data. We just sort of like leave it aside, because number one, that's for them to do, and we've made them aware, and they have this similar data, so it's it's fine. But number two, like, we wouldn't be able to act on that anyway, right? Because like we're not it's like, if we want to assist with their conservation efforts or efforts for access, that's fine. We're not going to be like, hey, we're Maine Appalachian Trail Land Trust, and we're going to like protect this sacred Wabanaki site. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So I do think, again, in that sort of data, you have to be judicious, and you have to have gone through sort of like a learning process on like what to do when you have that kind of data, and just to keep those lines of communication open, just in the same way as you would not, like you mentioned, a local town, you wouldn't go preserve a giant piece of forest that's in a particular town and then like not talk to any of the town officials, right? You wouldn't just speed ahead and do that. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. You wouldn't, all of this land in Maine, you want to make sure that you're not mistakenly sort of like infringing on a cultural right or something for one of the tribes. So I think it's about good communication, but it's also about not uncentering your organization yourself. Like, they have people who do this work. You don't need to sort of step in for them and do it,
Agreed. Absolutely. I have a question for you that I think I would start with Simon, and then Hannah Marie and Emily add to it, please, if you want. But so this is Kelly Porter writing that she's a graphic design professor, designing a cross-disciplinary class for design and environmental studies majors. I'm smiling because I think this is relevant to many of us who are probably dialing in, because it's a frontier for a lot of, mid-senior level professionals. So Are there any specifics that you would want students coming out of the school to know that would help them with this type of visual communication in the industry? She says, we'll be working with local partners in our area in East Tennessee on some low-key local projects. When I think like any specifics that you'd want students or any of us professionals who are trying to start getting into this type of design and communications, what would you want these students or us to know about this type of visual communication in the industry?
I mean, like people have mentioned, I would start with, I think, so we've all had the experience of like GIS data and like trying to make maps and they're like ugly and confusing, right? And so I think, and they don't help anybody and there's like blobs all over and and so we have our GIS contractors, a lot of times we'll get what they've done and we're like, oh, this looks great. And then other people are like, no, it doesn't. So I do think graphic designers, even just for their careers, it would benefit them to have some background in GIS. Like, what is GIS? Like, what is a raster? What is a vector? Like, how does it work? Just because I think getting GIS people to have better graphic design skills is probably not the way to go about it, right? Like, and the rest of us too. I think the rest of us, it would be valuable for people to learn about GIS data because it's in so many things now. It's in politics, it's in social science, it's in epidemiology. Everything ties back to GIS, and so I think it would behoove people who are in that graphic design kind of art world to sort of have that knowledge rather than the other way around. It's funny, when we were doing the panelist slides, that last slide I had that showed the photo view, and it has a bunch of numbers that our graphic designer put in there. Our graphic designer has no idea what we're doing, but she's a graphic designer, right? So we can say like, okay, here's this that goes here, and then gradually she's sort of like, oh, okay, I get it now. But when we're working at the component stage, she's like, I don't know, like what this blob means or why this is significant here. And I do think it's working okay for us, but if you want graphic designers to be over that hump and be like, okay, I get what GIS is, I get a little bit of what you're trying to do here and what the data is you're working with. So
yeah, I think that starts to answer one of the other questions that's here, is like, once we have all this data from GIS or from traditional knowledge, how can we use it to communicate the urgency to stakeholders, politicians, government, and the general public in an easy way? I think what you've said, Simon, is a beginning to that, like beginning advice to do that. Does any of you want to add any more to it, to either of those questions? Go ahead.
I think maybe sitting with the communities and asking what they want to communicate and how they want to communicate would be maybe advice that has been really, really helpful for me, actually just sitting with the people and saying, what is it that you want to communicate? What is the urgent thing that you want to communicate? And what are the most important points that you want to make sure are communicated out of there? I think there's so many visualizations that you can create with the information from these communities or from the environmental sector, but making sure that it's accurate to what the people want to actually communicate.
Awesome. I'm scanning the chat box. I think that I have a last question for everybody that might take up the rest of our time. So I'm going to ask it now. But if we have a few more minutes, there's a couple other little questions that we can ask in the chat box. Thank you, attendees so much for attending and also for dropping your questions, your other comments. We had some advice and resources provided from attendees. Thank you for those. I'd like each of you to think about, how did your organization first decide to incorporate climate into your work? I want to get at like the origin story. What was it that pushed you, your colleagues, your leadership to actually intentionally shift and change some of what you did because of actual physical realities, climate changes impacting your goals differently? And what was hard and what are you proud of now about that, now that's behind you? I'd love to hear from each of you.
I can jump in first.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I actually I would say, I saw this was the most important issue facing our world. and that it was going to be the thing I had to work on because it was the thing that I think we should all be as a world focusing on. And then also just being aware that in my local landscape, I was seeing so many changes, and then speaking with people who had been there for hundreds and thousands of years, how many changes have been there as well. And it just was too overwhelming not to make it the focus of our work. And I think I was also tired of kept hearing like, oh, there's a crisis, there's a biodiversity crisis, but then actually looking and seeing there are so many people that are taking action. And for me, it was so inspirational that they're taking action and they need more support doing the work that they're already doing. And then realizing that there are so many sectors that have already solved all these problems. There are platforms that help to manage data and coordinate organizations and communities. It exists. So why wasn't it being applied to the environmental sector? And then just feeling that personal responsibility, realizing that, okay, it's just not being applied. It needs to be applied. And so that became the focus of our team's work. And one final thing is I also find it really inspirational that most technology has an origin in environmentalism. So even personal computing, like the iPad was first originally thought of to use as a communication tool about deforestation. Is that what it's used for now? No, because people have thought that it's more money in gaming or in financial sector. And that just felt so unfortunate that people like Alan Kay and incredible technologists did imagine it for this. So that became the focus of our work and a deep inspiration in why we're doing what we're doing.
Thank you. Hannah Marie, anything to add from your point of view?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when I like what decided us to focus on it. And it's really not necessarily like a decision. It was more of a necessity and recognizing that everything is a holistic approach. Everything that I have been rooted in my education, my approach to this work since Emily, like I knew this was going to be a major issue and that climate was going to be my workforce, but of course I'm working in coastal erosion, I'm working in migratory bird, and sometimes it does feel a little overwhelming because I'm also having to become kind of a jack of at least understanding the priorities in each way that they're faced by the communities that I'm working with. And so understanding that climate is that holistic system in and of itself, and then going into working in these spaces with communities and getting specific about the fact they want to address the fisheries issues in their community, or that their most priority issue is the coastal erosion they're seeing. And then I think I would also add that to Emily's point as well, that there's this kind of doom and gloom that I think a lot of our entities and organizations have gone through when it comes to climate. And I think where I've decided to focus my work and what we're doing with applied on the ground work is the empowerment factor, and how so often a lot of what's communicated along with like the urgency to act on climate change is the fact that the lack of capacity to address it, and that is so untrue. The technology is there, the communities are there, and if we just focus on empowering them, providing them with tools and space to lead and to communicate and be the experts in their own rights, the capacity just grows from there. And so I think that's something that is so integral in what I'm doing in the work that we are doing through ISN, is the empowerment of communities and providing a software tool where they are able to do that work.
Yeah, that really speaks to me, the power of what's already there and actually setting it up for the success that we need. Simon.
I would just say it's the best data for the most urgent problem, right? Climate change. So, we use the TNC resilience data, and we've also found that, it's the best kind of single data to sort of build around, because it's like an avatar, right? For other stuff. It's a stand-in for like, you don't just have to have like brook trout habitat, because that's just brook trout. And we wrestled with that internally for a long time when we were putting together our component data, where people would be like, no, we need this, because then the brook trout people will be mad if we don't have it in here, or, we're not covering that aspect. But the climate change data takes into account all those things. Because climate change affects everybody, right? It's not, even if you're in the water or you're terrestrial, it's everybody. And so we built around that because it's the best data for that. And we can, the bottom line is like, oh, we're going after that land, right? Because that conserving that parcel is really important, because look, like it's and it kind of cuts through some of the sort of like, you know, the political or the communication problems with climate change, you can say like, look, we have this data now. It's sort of like quantifying that, and we can sort of go after things in that way. And I think that also, speaking to like, you know, the proudest thing or whatever, is I've heard from people who are like, oh, this is so cool. Like I didn't really get it before. You know, like we've heard a lot from like foundations, you know, where it's like foundation board members who are like, oh yeah, this project seems great. We're like, oh no, now I get it. Cause it's like, right, I can see, okay, like now I get it now. And you know, when I do like a public talk at a public library, people come up to me after and they're like, oh, I have a question because like I was up in that spot and I didn't realize like da 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 da. And it's like those are like the best things, right?
Yeah.
Not when like, you know, another GIS person is like, oh, this is great. Like, yeah, it's like, I know, you know, like we've already talked about this, but you know, like members of the public, because that's how you advance these things, like kind of inch by inch, you know, like moving
Yeah.
along.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad I got invited to moderate. This has been great for me to listen and absorb too. And I think that just the power of data visualization, communications, it's so important because we're dealing with so many different cultures. And I don't just mean people, I mean, even like fields. So I think the conservation field has a rigid culture. We want to preserve to historic conditions. We want to maintain and protect the status quo. We have to break through that and start planning for future conditions and scenarios. And then these foundation board members, these local partners on the ground, they all have a different level and perspective. And these tools are clearly ways of bringing about those light bulb moments and pushing people to break through what their norm is. And hopefully I think, well, not hopefully, I really believe these are part of the right answer to moving forward on increasing the number of organizations that do start making intentional shifts to incorporate climate change into their landscape conservation, but that also help communicate those impacts that landscape conservation organizations are making towards climate change and mitigating for it as well. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm not sure if I'm closing all the way, Jen. If I am, I'm happy to do so. I just want to make sure there wasn't any other remarks from the Salazar Center or from the network.
Liz, that's great. Thank you. We just want to remind people to register, stay tuned to register for the next webinar. And of course, everyone just keep an eye on the registration or look at the registration for our symposium in the fall. Like I said, we'd love to have all of you there. And just a big thank you to Liz, you as moderator, you were fantastic. And Simon, Emily, and Hannah, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Thank you to all of our attendees. Bye.